let's get started and jump right into it. Some of you may have heard from me this morning. My name is Pratima Singh. I'm a principal with the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. I do a lot of our research on different topics around sustainability, whether it's food and agriculture, food loss, waste, and of course, our very recent research on young adults' priorities in motion, which is basically examining what young adults between the range of 18 to 30 are thinking about as they make mobility decisions in urban centers. Thank you to Nissan, that is the sponsor of this research. And this is we're releasing this just now, so I wanted to give you a sneak peek into some of the insights. It's part of our Urban Futures initiative, where we look at how cities and urban centers can be drivers of change in providing climate solutions going forward. So to kick things off, why are we surveying young adults and we're thinking about sustainability and sustainable mobility in particular? So the first thing is that we want to think about what's going to happen in the future, right? Young adults obviously are going to be making these consumption decisions in the next few years, and examining what they're going to be prioritizing, what's driving their decision is pretty crucial as we think about how to build cities and transport systems that are much more sustainable. Speaking of transport systems, currently about 20%, 1/5 of CO2 emissions come from transport. So we really need to be thinking about how to make these choices much more sustainable. How do we make sure that we are less dependent on individual modes of transport, and thinking about sustainable modes of transport in the future. And then, of course, why urban? As you can see, a lot of the growth that we're going to see in the next 20 to 30 years, up to 2050, is going to be in cities. So being able to sort of capitalize on young people in cities is going to help us have the maximum impact. And so that's really kind of why we're thinking about understanding the drivers of sustainability for young people in cities. How did we think about, how did we come to some of these results and findings, which I'll share with you in just a moment, but it's important as a researcher, I think, to understand what's the methodology and the context behind it. So first, we wanted to understand those preferences. We surveyed 3,750 young adults, Gen Z, basically between the ages of 18 to 30, across 15 cities. And if you look at the fine print there, you'll be able to see the cities span Asia, Europe, North America as well. And we surveyed about 10 experts. So we didn't just collect the data, we also kind of drove into, no pun intended, what's actually enabling that decision. Why are we thinking about, why are young people making the decisions that they are, through some of that qualitative insight as well. All right, to start, what is driving what is driving mobility choices, if you will, in young adults in urban centers? The data very clearly says that when young people are thinking about where to live and what choices they want to make in terms of what's driving their choices in terms of living, places to live, cost of living could be the climate we're in, could be a bunch of other things, but cost of living comes number one, with 64% prioritizing that. Safety and crime rates, and then transport and connectivity were tied at second place, basically with about 59% prioritizing that as a factor. That said, we also asked a question on, would you change your travel habits to be more sustainable? And majority of respondents did say yes, but it's only about 57%. So what we find through some of this data is that, yes, they're willing to make those choices, but you also have to consider things like cost, safety, and of course, infrastructure, travel time, other things, when we're thinking about daily travel in particular. So travel time, cost, safety were the other two factors when we specifically focused on the factors that come under daily travel. So what does this mean? Like, why are we even talking about this? Why is this critical? Because a lot of times we find businesses and companies and even urban planners highlight that, right, the younger generation is much more sustainability focused. And as we, expand and look at the time horizon 2030, 2040, we're going to see people making more sustainable choices. Yes, but it has to be there has to be no trade-off. It cannot be at the cost of convenience or cost or safety. And so what urban planners really need to be prioritizing is safe, sustainable choices that enable young people to think about environmental concerns as part of it rather than as something they have to give up. All right, so then we also dug deeper. I'm going to share lots of interesting stats with you, but we also asked currently, what is your daily travel choice? I guess, what is your mode of daily transportation? And currently we see that majority still use personal cars, basically, whether it's gas or fuel, traditional fuel cars, basically, and that's 58%. But it's also tied with 58% who also say they use public transport. What's interesting is that when we dug deeper into that public transport question, we also found out that 41% currently say limited availability of public transport is basically the main reason that they choose not to use public transport. So if we think about cities like New Delhi or maybe Bangkok or others, there are factors around availability there. We also wanted to understand a little bit more about active mobility, biking or walking. And there, of course, you can see that 43% found that weather conditions, challenging weather conditions, heat, and then, of course, rains and floods, other factors hinder their ability to, participate in active mobility as well. So there is a good intention, if you will, but sometimes that convenience, again, of cars can be the main driving factor here. When we asked about the future, where do you see or what do you think is going to be the main mode of transport for the future? You can see, number one, electric cars, very much going to be the mode of choice. 35% highlighting that they would prefer to drive electric cars in the next 10 years. Hybrid cars follow closely with 27%. Public transport and active mobility also sort of fall a little bit further down. But it's interesting because we do see that shift. We see currently you see only about 23% on personally owned electric cars, and that's going to increase to 35%. So that's kind of a global trend that we're seeing with young people also driving that. The other key finding that we wanted to highlight was we wanted to kind of go deeper into some of the data and find out what's going on, and is there an income level or an emerging market / developed market angle here that we can explore. And so you can see that there is part of that. Emerging cities, interestingly enough, are really kind of the ones that are driving this preference for electric vehicles. On the left-hand side, you'll see the graph here, which shows developed markets. Right now, do you see EVs as part of your daily travel? It says about 19% see that. In the future, it's going up to 31%. But even currently, we see emerging market young people prioritizing that with 28%, and that's going up to 44% in the next 5 years. And so it's really interesting that emerging economies and emerging cities are the ones kind of driving this to the fore. And some can argue that there is some positives there. You see, and we've highlighted here in the case study, which is Shanghai, that there are incentives, policy incentives, and others that have been really successful in this shift. But also, if you dig deeper into some other markets, for instance, New Delhi or Bangkok or others, you see developed markets don't face as many of those challenges around quality of life, quality of air that developing markets and emerging cities do. And so that's another factor that is taken into consideration when we think about why young people really are prioritizing EVs in emerging markets. Now, speaking of China, we cannot talk about electric vehicles without focusing on China. Shanghai has been one of the cities that we surveyed, and you'll see here it's got a very high score. 53% expect to use EVs in the next 10 years. It's the highest among the 15 cities that we surveyed, and over 50% of the vehicles that were registered are already electric vehicles in Shanghai. And a lot of this is because the city leadership and the government has actually made this a priority, and not just in terms of incentives, whether it's financial incentives or non-financial incentives for personal buyers. Even in terms of public transport, there are city-wide goals in basically providing more electric public buses and public transport goals as well. And then, of course, some of the non-financial incentives for EV buyers are around the number plates. So, you have to register through a competitive lottery system, and that's exempt for electric vehicles. And that's really spurring demand for EVs in Shanghai. And it's interesting because we do see charging infrastructure and other battery capabilities still being an inhibitor. That's much more an issue in developing markets than developed. But that said, there is very much a clear trend of of emerging markets driving the shift to EVs. The other lens that we wanted to take to examine some of this was around income gaps. And so on the left here, you will see we wanted to go deeper now from EVs, moving on to active mobility and public transport. What's going on here? So we find that over the next 10 years, there's going to be some convergence in how the different income groups are going to be traveling. And so there's going to be much more of that closing of the gap, if you will. Currently, if you look at the active mobility section, you'll see that about 50% of low-income groups say that they participate in active mobility, versus next year, in the next 10 years, we see it going down to 23%. Part of it could also be it's shifting towards electric cars. But you do see that the gap between the low income and the high income, which currently is about 9 for active mobility, 50 to 41, it's converging from 23 to 20. And similarly, even in public transport, you see a lot more low income groups having to take public transport. And then you see that trend becoming basically exactly the same at 25% in the next 10 years. Now, the other thing about public transport as well, which we highlighted right up front, is that better infrastructure is really critical. Better infrastructure and more convenience in supporting the shift towards public transport and active mobility. The case study we wanted to highlight here was Hong Kong. Again, a lot of different Asian case studies around Hong Kong and Singapore come up when we think about public transport. But really, what we found was that if you look at the data for Hong Kong, about 90% of all passenger journeys are happening on public transport. And that's because it's convenient, it's safe, it's a good infrastructure, it's reliable, and young people are happy with that. They want to continue using public transport. It's also affordable. As you can see, the approximate rates are 0.46 to 6.7 US dollars. I mean, in the UK right now, I took the train in the morning, it cost me £5. But it's still very important. Obviously, we have a standard of USD versus pounds, but very important for it to be affordable even for young people. And then also, it is important that the public transport system makes money as well. And so you can see a model here, which is the rail to property business model that was pretty successful for Hong Kong in order to actually manage some of its transport costs. And for some of you who are familiar with Asia, what that means is that if the MTR constructs a rail line, what they also encourage is support and stakeholder engagement with private sectors, developers, to be able to build residential and commercial properties above and around its stations, which then also increases property values for developers. And then they get a cut from the leasing or the sale of those properties. But essentially, it's really about thinking creatively about some of those solutions in order to encourage public transport and active mobility that's needed for the next few years. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but we also have data to support it. When we tried to understand what exactly would support the uptake of public transport, you can see better infrastructure, safety enhancements are really critical. Pedestrian deaths, we've got a statistic here, between 2010 and 2021 increased by 3%. And that's not something we should be having. It should be reversing that trend. Sidewalks, unsafe walking conditions, all of that is really driving this trend against active mobility in particular, but also, of course, unsafe crossings. I was in a conversation earlier this morning as well. We were talking with someone about bike lanes and how bike lanes are critical, but also still can be pretty unsafe as you're thinking about busy rush hour traffic. What do cities need to do in order to support this? Redesign. We've got some examples from Shanghai. We've talked about the 15-minute city. We've seen different European cities doing this as well. Is that one possible solution? Upgrading. Of course, you want to upgrade existing infrastructure. Repurposing, which is things like cycling networks and car lanes. How do you encourage that? We've also got the Great Belt around in Atlanta to support that. And then, of course, retrofitting. And King's Cross Station here is a pretty neat example of being able to use that and do that effectively. And the last thing I wanted to share is that being able to think about this from a systems perspective is going to be critical. So it's also being able to say, we can encourage active mobility, but that active mobility then also enables more use of public transport. So we don't want to just be thinking about it in silos. We want to think about how can you put yourself in the user's shoes and then, encourage multiple modes in a single journey rather than specifically one car, if you will. And then again, we have another quote here, which talks about you can't really have a one-size-fits-all approach. Every city has unique challenges, and therefore the solutions need to be customized in order to work best for young people, but also the citizens more generally. Last closing key takeaways, I guess, sustainability needs to fit into everyday life, should not be a trade-off between sustainability and cost or convenience. Better infrastructure needs to be a priority for the next 10 years. We need to be thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective, and young adults should definitely have a seat at the table when we're thinking about these policies and decisions. So I'll end there. Thank you. If you do have questions, I see the timer's buzzing, so I'll be around, but maybe we'll touch base after. And I would love to invite Emily here to take us to the next session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Mel. Thanks, Emily.